Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Ford Presidential Library. My name is Elaine Didier, and it's my privilege to serve as the director of the library here in Ann Arbor and the museum in Grand Rapids. And it's also a privilege to welcome you on behalf of David Ferriero, the Archivist of the United States. So tonight's program is brought to you by the National Archives and Records Administration with additional support from the Ford Presidential Foundation. We're very grateful to all of you who are members of Friends of Ford because it is your contributions that make these programs possible. The contributions fund our feature exhibits at the library and museum, the research travel grants that bring people from around the world, all of our educational and public programs like this one. Tonight, we're very pleased to be hosting Bryan Becker to talk about economics and the presidency. And especially, we'd like to give a warm welcome to members of Bryan's family, his wife, Grace, and his mother, Joanne. So Grace and Joanne, welcome to the Ford Library. Before introducing our speaker, let me give you a little bit of Becker family history, because that name might be familiar to you. Bryan's father, Benton, served as counsel to President Ford in the 1970s. He represented him during the House and Senate confirmation hearings for the vice presidency following Spiro Agnew's resignation in the fall of '73. And he later was the person who negotiated the terms of the pardon of Nixon in 1974. Benton has been a speaker several times. We've had him twice at the museum. First time as a part of an eyewitness exhibit. We were doing Eyewitness to History, and of course he was an eyewitness to the pardon. And also we had him during our slavery exhibit where he talked using his constitutional law background discussing the Dred Scott decision. Here at the library, we last hosted him in 2010, and I have to say that his story of the intricate details of the negotiations with Richard Nixon stand in my mind as one of the very most memorable and outstanding programs that we've ever hosted. His presentation of the legal complexities underlying the pardon were so clear that I understood for the first time what it all meant and how it came to be. And I also wish that I had the chance to take a con law course with him. So he was a great teacher, and we have that on tape if you happen to miss that program. Benton Becker was a trustee of the Ford Foundation for many, many years and very supportive for all of us for our work at the library and museum. And we're honored to have Benton's papers here at the library, and today had a lot of fun with our staff showcasing some of the highlights for the family in visiting. So that was fun for all concerned. Tonight's speaker is Benton's son, Bryan, who in 2015 joined the foundation board as a trustee, and so it is an honor for us to have him continuing the family legacy on the foundation board. This is also the first ever instance of our hosting first the father and then the son for presentations here at the library, so we're making a little bit of history. Bryan, in his own right, is the founder of Precision Economics, which provides economic expertise for litigation, regulation, and public policy. He has served as an economic expert witness and consultant for 25 years. This following a PhD from the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania and a BA from Johns Hopkins. He has produced more than 300 economic reports for Fortune 500 corporations, international law firms, the Internal Revenue Service, the Australian Taxation Service, and other tax authorities. I think you get a theme of taxation as his expertise. He has also provided testimony in numerous legal venues, has also been a visiting professor at Johns Hopkins in the MBA program, Marymount University Business School, and also the George Washington University MBA program. In addition to the consulting and expert witness work, Dr. Becker serves on the audit committee of the Mathematical Association of America. In the first of what we hope is a growing series of collaborations, Bryan spoke last evening, as you'll see, at Albion College at the Ford Institute for Leadership in Public Policy and Service at Albion. And now tonight, I hope you will join me in welcoming him to speak at the Ford Library, continuing the Becker tradition.
Well, Well, thank you, Elaine, and thank you all for coming. It's really, really an honor for me to speak about this topic and to speak on the heels of all the history my father has had with this organization and our family has had with the Ford family and the Ford presidency. So without further ado, I will get started. Okay. Hopefully you guys can read this, but if not, I did say this was a very personal experience for me, and it started at a very young age. I was 8 years old when I was given an assignment in class to write a letter to President Ford, President Lincoln, or President Washington. And I wasn't too smart as an 8-year-old, but I did know President Lincoln and President Washington definitely would not respond to my letter. But I didn't know about President Ford. I knew, well, we'll talk about more the relationship our family had, but I wrote a letter to President Ford, and I'll read it to you for those that are having trouble seeing it. Dear Mr. President Ford, this is May 27, 1975. I would like to know why the prices of gas are lower in Florida than they are here. The prices of gas in Florida are 45 cents, and the prices of gas in Washington are 59 cents. The meat prices are also high. They used to be 99 cents a pound, and now they are $1.99 a pound. A couple edits from my teacher. I would also like to know how you and Nelson are doing. Now, President Rockefeller. Do you have any problems with other countries? Sincerely, Bryan, Becker. So this was me as an 8-year-old, and one thing you will notice is a lot of numbers in there. From a very young age, math was a very big deal to my parents and me, drilling me with math, so I was always focused on numbers, and that did come up a lot. But we sent this out in May of 1975. I finished school, went away to camp, and I came home and I got this. And so my wife will, and my mother will tell you, impatience is one of my strengths. So I'm not the most patient person. So I get this thing and I'm ripping the envelope as you see here. I'm ripping the envelope as you see. Actually, I think I have I'm very impatient. So you can see the ripping of the envelope there and the ripping of the envelope here. But my mom was very patient and she put it back together. We did get a response from President Ford, which was very nice. Now this, even the best of you will have a tough time reading that. So I won't read it to you, but you can get copies and whatnot. But ultimately, it's fairly detailed on responses to how economics has this effect in this country or this area, and opportunity cost and location savings and different parts of, and inflation. So it really got into detail. And I was a math kid, so I got some of these concepts, but it really was beyond the 8-year-old in my mind. So, but I did read it over and over again, and my parents had both this, and this all framed in the house for many years. And in fact, now, as you saw from what Elaine was so gracious in saying, I have an economics firm and I'm an economist, and the first thing I see when I walk in my office is this frame of me as an 8-year-old pre-economist doing this. The other thing I see is this. So this is my father with President Ford. We think talking about the pardon in 1974. We don't know for sure, but it's probably the more famous picture of my father with President Ford. And that's really, I think, why I got a response from President Ford. It was a cute letter, but it wasn't that cute. It didn't demand that much attention. But Dad brought it into the office and said, do you think you could help my little son on this? And so Dad was a counsel, and as Elaine said, he was on the board for many years, and it's really been my honor to continue that tradition. And so with that in mind, I decided, although I'm an economist, what my interest outside of economics and math is really to read and study and learn history. So I've always been a big history buff, especially with American history and the presidents. So it got me to thinking, what could I research and think about with President Ford? Well, we know a lot about President Ford, okay? So we know Everyone knows about his football expertise, and certainly there's a lot out in the lobby that we all saw, and we're at the University of Michigan, where everyone knows he was a military hero. He had a very strong and long career in Congress. We all know that. He was the vice president, of course, before he became president. Some of you may know the story in football about how in his senior year, Gerald Ford got a scar, allegedly from the first Heisman Trophy winner from the University of Chicago. Does anyone know who that was? Yes, sir. Jay Berwanger is correct. That is correct. The University of Chicago. He was a junior. He won the Heisman Trophy the following year. And back then, Chicago was part of the Big Ten Conference. And in fact, Chicago, believe it or not, won a national championship in the early part of the 20th century, breaking a streak that Michigan had with Hurry Up Yost and that crowd. But that I can divert a lot, but I'm going to try to stay away from too much diversion. So there are other things, if you dive further, you'd know about his role in the Warren Commission, his role with the pardon, as we talked about earlier, President Ford, his role as a magazine model. Some of that is in this library, some of that is out at the museum. I didn't know much about that, but he had done some modeling, and that is in fact him on the cover of Cosmopolitan from 1942. I don't believe he did much of that after the war, but there was a time where he did some of that, and I think there was even an exhibit out in the lobby on some of his modeling. But professionally, he was an attorney like most presidents, and that really, I wouldn't say most presidents, but that was the most common thing that we had from our presidents. So I started to think about that, and I went a little further, and I saw that, well, this is where Gerald Ford went to college, or just down the street here, and he studied none other than economics. Very true and dear to my heart. And in fact, he was the only president of our 45 presidents, I guess really 44 people, 45 presidents, but none of them studied economics. President Trump did study business, George W. Bush studied business, but no one else had that training. And as we'll get into, it's such an important part of what presidents are tasked with and what they're written up about and what they do, that it's interesting to me that it's so complicated, even for people that are trained in economics and have years of experience, it's still hard to figure out what to do economically, and these guys really don't even have that training, so it's a particularly tough thing to do. Okay? So there's a lot of issues in economic history. You'll see that with citizens, with the press, with the president, and it even would boil into all sorts of meetings and protests. In the 1890s, there was a group called Coxey's Army that descended on the Capitol. There was a group in the 1930s, the Bonus March. And those types of things. It wasn't like we have today where every week there's a different march where people just get their pictures and selfies on Facebook. I mean, there were sort of bigger issues that happened every generation or every 10 years. But they were big things that really did happen and had big impacts. Okay. And some of the things you can see through the eyes of presidents. And I want to give you a few here as kind of anecdotes as we work our way historically from the beginning of our republic until more recent times. Okay? And of course, the beginning of the republic with presidents starts with George Washington. There was a whiskey tax because we needed to raise revenue. It was a new country and there was not much revenue in the country. So the Western Pennsylvania farmers didn't like that. They were sort of very upset in the sense that, oh, well, we moved from having a king who told us what to do, and all of a sudden, this new president and this new government are telling us, look, you've got to give us your taxes, and they didn't like that. In fact, they burned the tax collectors' home during that time. So now this particular economic reaction of a president was somewhat unique, what that President Washington did. What President Washington did is he led the military out to Western Pennsylvania and basically stopped the revolt. So physically went out there. I haven't seen that. I can't really see President Trump doing that. Nothing against President Trump. I don't see him going on a horse with the military, and I haven't really seen that. There are some presidents you could see doing that. But the point of that was it set a precedent that we could impose taxes and that we could sort of keep the country going. Not everything would create a full revolt. So that happened, and we continued to have the original founders as presidents for many years. But then we kind of went into a new area or new era of presidents that began with Andrew Jackson. So some of you may know Andrew Jackson kind of was an older guy. At that time, he was the oldest guy to be president, and he almost became president in 1824, and there was a kind of what they call a corrupt bargain between Henry Clay and John Quincy Adams that got Quincy Adams the presidency. That, along with Jackson's natural distrust for the Eastern elites, just fueled his fire during those years. And when he got to become president 4 years later in 1828, he really still had that distaste of the Eastern elites. And nothing really symbolized the Eastern elites to him, at least at that time, more than the National Bank. And so the National Bank was coming up for a recharter when he came into office, very shortly after that. And in fact, he had a famous quote to his first vice president, who was? Calhoun. Very good. Thank you, John C. Calhoun. Second president, or second vice president was? Very good. This is a good group. This is a very good group. All right. This is going to be a tough one. All right. I'll be ready for you. I'll be ready for you. So, but this was to Calhoun. He said to Calhoun, "The bank is trying to kill me, sir, but I shall kill it." And in fact, he did. He did kill the bank. He did not, and it wasn't rechartered. And what happened is there was a short economic downturn, but it didn't really have a big impact on Jackson's popularity. He won re-election, and the government continued without the National Bank. And in fact, the government not only continued, but the country really grew and prospered quite a bit during the time after Jackson, and even during his time, with a small interruption for the Civil War. And we moved from this very agrarian population to a more urban population. And why that became important kind of escalated in the 1896 election. So the farmers, and I'm not going to get into the details of the economic issues in too much here, but the farmers and the Westerners in general wanted the free coinage of silver in addition to the gold standard that we had. However, at that time, that was not what the Republicans were after. William McKinley was going to be the nominee. He did not want the free coinage of silver, but it was something that could come up in the Democratic Party. And in fact, a 36-year-old Democrat by the name of William Jennings Bryan had this to say about that issue.
You shall not sacrifice mankind upon the cross of soul.
And as far as everywhere, we will answer the demand for gold standards by saying to them, "You shall not press down upon the proud labor this crown of thorns. You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold."
Okay, that's very good. So that wasn't intended to be a question, but I appreciate the answer nonetheless. I have one more of those for later, just as a heads up. But I appreciate that. That was the famous Cross of Gold speech, and it helped Bryan become the nominee for president in 1896. He didn't win, but it did give him the nomination, and McKinley ended up winning. But one thing that's of interest, and that's actually a picture of, I think that's actually, well, we'll see. That's from the election as well. But the interesting discussion that I've seen, although I've never really understood exactly how far you can take this, but many people have suggested that Frank Baum, who wrote The Wizard of Oz, was writing it about the 1896 election. Different characterizations of William McKinley as the wizard and the Cowardly Lion being William Jennings Bryan and the gold standard being the Yellow Brick Road and things like that. I haven't seen it to be consistent enough to say, yes, he definitely did this, and obviously Mr. Baum's not with us anymore, but it's interesting to see that there's a lot of tie-ins to that election at that time. Okay? Now, sadly, McKinley did go all the way through that particular term, and he was reelected in 1900. And this time, however, he tried something different. He brought in a new vice president by the name of Theodore Roosevelt. And in fact, he ran against William Jennings Bryan. This was the first time that one candidate had beaten the same candidate twice in a row from the major parties. So Jennings Bryan lost twice in a row to McKinley, and Jennings Bryan brought in himself a new vice presidential candidate. Let's see if you guys can get that. Who was that in 1900? No, William Jennings Bryan's candidate, or vice presidential running mate. That was a tough one. All right, good. His name was Adlai Stevenson. And he was actually previously, did you say that? I'm sorry? Okay. Previously, he had been the vice president under Cleveland. But the thing that's kind of interesting, and once again I'm diverting, is there are two instances in our republic where the same two candidates ran against each other and there was a sweep. The one guy won twice. McKinley, and the second time was Eisenhower, and he beat Adlai Stevenson. So it is a little bit of an interesting circle there. Sadly, McKinley was assassinated in Buffalo, New York, about 40 years before my mother was born in Buffalo, New York. But similar to what had happened 20 years ago, which was with James Garfield, originally there was a thought that the bullet that had gotten into McKinley was not lethal. But it turned out that it was. Different reasons, different medical reasons, but it turned out he didn't make it. And Teddy Roosevelt became the president. So as you know, there was a lot of concentrated wealth during that time in this post-Gilded Age type of period, and a lot of monopolies and trust. In fact, there were laws on the books to prosecute the monopolies and trusts from at least 1890, but they hadn't really been activated and hadn't really been used. But Roosevelt made it clear he was really going to go after this. And in fact, the first case that really came up, the first notable case, was the Northern Securities Railroad case. And I'm not going to go into too much detail to bore you there, but J.P. Morgan was really at the center of the Northern Securities. And he really thought, and that's a picture of, you can see J.P. Morgan by the nose. He always has this big nose. So he's in a picture there. So J.P. Morgan really thought of himself as above the government, not necessarily in an illegal way, but he thought that if a Northern Securities case was to be brought, that people would come to him and be very deferential to him. Roosevelt wasn't like that. Roosevelt interrupted a dinner party that Morgan was having to let him know this was coming about. Morgan expected Roosevelt to then come to his office in New York to kind of beg for a negotiation. In fact, he made Morgan come down to the White House, and actually from that didn't get anywhere, and the U.S. actually won that case with Northern Securities. Roosevelt eventually won his own election in 1904, chose sort of not to run again. In 1908, he chose not to run. In 1912, he kind of changed his mind, and that didn't work either. But he did get a good 7.5 years in the White House. Okay. Well, we're going to get back to Roosevelt again, but a different Roosevelt. And probably the most famous or infamous economic event that we've had in this country is the Great Depression. And this kind of stereotype of it is with the Hoovervilles, the selling apples, the hobos jumping onto the trains. Those types of things are very common. The stock market crash, Hoover decided to do tariffs and bank loans. It's always hard to say after the fact, and it's always hard to know how things were in that time, but the mathematics or the data didn't look good for Hoover for sure by the time the 1932 election came about. It's hard to know exactly what would have happened if those policies continued exactly, but one way or another, Franklin Roosevelt was running against him as a Democrat. Franklin Roosevelt had gotten married in the White House. He married his sixth cousin, Eleanor, and she was the niece of Teddy Roosevelt. So he actually gave her away at the White House because she had lived with him after her father, his brother, had committed suicide. But Roosevelt really had a two-pronged approach. And the first prong of it was really more an emotional appeal to get the voters to know who he is and hear his voice and get comfortable with him through these fireside chats. But the first of those came at his own inauguration.
So first of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror, which paralyzes needed effort to convert retreat into advance. We face our common difficulties. They concern, thank God, only material things. The withered leaves of industrial enterprise lie on every side.
Okay. It's a great, you can actually listen to the whole thing and it might be more interesting than me, but at least for today we're going to just cut it off there. But it's, that's the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, a very famous line. And that, along with these radios that people would have in their living rooms and they would hear him on a weekly basis, were to help just the mindset of the American public. And it's a non-trivial part of economics to kind of get people less fearful about what's happening and to invest and spend money and do things. But he also came up with ideas of spending money, basically, spending lots of government money in lots of different ways. The results were kind of mixed, to be honest. There were times where it was going up, some times where it was going down in terms of unemployment, in terms of inflation. By 1939, the things didn't look so good. We still had unemployment at 17.2%, even 6-7 years into his term. But one way or another, by the force of World War II, the economy did recover quite well from there. So just another instance of how presidents have had to deal with big economic issues. Okay. So the issues, when I talk about how big they are, they've gotten a lot bigger over the years. I mean, a lot bigger. So literally, President Trump's budget is 500,000 times the size of President Washington's early budgets. Okay? And we're going to go through some of the math on that. I'm not going to give you too many math questions, but part of that, of course, is population growth. Part of that is productivity, and part of it is inflation. The last part is that government spending has become a bigger share of the pie than it was in the early years. And we'll kind of walk through that with some graphs here. This is a pretty easy graph. From 1790, when we had population more along the lines of 3 million people, to today, where we have more than 300 million people, you see kind of about a 100-fold increase in our population. You kind of expect, all else being equal, that's going to increase the size of the economy, the size of federal spending by that level. Okay. Now here's one that may take a little explanation, but not too much. Basically, if you're in the 1790s and you're just a farmer using your hands and very modest tools, your level of efficiency is going to be a lot less than if you're using the technical things that we have today, all the inventions, whether you're a farmer, whether you're working here, whether you're working anywhere. The point is, workers today in first world countries like the US are far more productive than they were 200 years ago. In fact, 200 years ago, everyone was pretty much as non-productive across the board. Even in what we call third world countries, they tended to be even a little bit more productive than what you saw in Europe and the US. There wasn't much difference, but things have changed a lot. In fact, today, the first world, and that's probably the biggest gap, is the first world countries tend to be 20, 30, 50 times more productive per person than what we see in the third world countries. And similarly, what we see today in the US is about 35, 40 times what we had productivity per person. In other words, we are able to create more per person today through these innovations in the last 200 years. So it's quite a big jump in that time, and I think it's important to keep that in mind. It's not just the fact that we have 300 million local farmers versus 3 million local farmers. We have 300 million people doing lots of different things that integrate and take advantage of a lot of new technologies. Here's the thing that I've probably found the most interesting, maybe you will not, but this is, to me, the concept of inflation. I'm a 51-year-old, and it's always been there in my life. It's always been an important part of it. I remember when Grace and I bought our first house, I told my grandparents, oh, well, we spent, I think it was $200,000. They said, oh my God, you know, when I bought my first house, it was $10,000. And that experience, probably everyone in this room had some experience like that. My first car, oh my God, it's so much less. But if you went back to and you asked your grandparents if they had that same conversation with their grandparents, they wouldn't have had it. The point I'm getting at is, this is really kind of the consumer price index, and we really didn't have a jump until World War II. In other words, inflation wasn't really a big issue until that time. We had a few blips, different wars and the like, but really we started to just have everything take off after World War II. So the overall impact is that the prices today are a lot higher than they were back in, say, 1780, 1790, or 1800, but it's all because of the last 60, 70 years, okay? And we haven't really had huge inflation in any one year. It's not like the Germanys of the 1920s or the Confederate States during the Civil War. We've just had consistent positive inflation, 8, 5, 10%. And we've had something called the magic of compounding, the rule of 72. Is anyone familiar with the rule of 72? Okay. Yes, okay, well, I'll do it real quick. So basically, as a back of the envelope, quick way to figure out how quickly something will double, if you look at the growth rate, so let's say you've got a growth rate of 8% every year, that will double in about 9 years because you divide that into 72. It's the rule of 72. If something's growing at 3% a year, it will take about 24 years to double. If it's growing at 12% a year, it will take about 6 years to double. It's not perfect, but it's pretty darn close. So if you kind of use that rule of 72, it doesn't take too long to get doubling. And if you get a doubling and then a quadrupling and a multiplying by 8, all of a sudden it really does tend to jump up. And one other thing I wanted to bring up is that these gaps that you see here aren't really just theoretical. We were in Albion yesterday, and we saw one of these signs that you guys are probably familiar with that said, Coca Cola, 5 cents always, or something like it, always 5 cents. Literally, Coca Cola sold for 5 cents for about 70 years. From basically this period when Gerald Ford's dad was a baby to this period where Gerald Ford was a young congressman, the price didn't go up. And it wasn't that Coca Cola was altruistic and wanted to give people a good deal. It was that there really wasn't that much inflation at that point. And the 5 cents that you're paying for Coca Cola there, you're not paying 5 cents anymore. All of a sudden it's $1 or something to that effect. So anyways, just something to think about, that we've got inflation as another factor that's caused the economy to, at least numbers-wise, look a lot bigger. Okay? And the final part, this is on the left, is the share of the economy. The economy is generally referred to as the gross domestic product. And it's the share of the economy that is the federal budget. So the federal budget here is very small. And it stays very small really until before the Great Depression. It's very, very small, always in the sort of 2 to 3% of GDP during that entire time period. There are a few blips. War of 1812, Civil War, but in general it stays very low. It goes up, it even goes up a little bit during, goes up a lot during the World War I, but still goes back down. It's going up slowly, but you get a huge jump during the, both the World War II, but even after World War II, what happened is we had this big shift. So now, give or take now, we're a little over 20%, and back in those days we were about 2%. So not only is the economy getting much bigger, but the federal government's portion of the economy itself is growing. So all of these things, if you took the math, this is give or take 10 times the rate. This is give or take 15 times. This is give or take 35 times. And this is give or take 100 times. If you multiplied all those numbers together, you get about 500,000. And that's why the budget today is that much bigger than it was in those days. Okay? President Ford wasn't quite at the size level that President Trump had, but it was pretty darn close. And he had a lot of things on his plate. So the first thing is he had high inflation. I'm going to take you back to the letter that he wrote me, because President Ford was an economist, and he knew that we had high inflation, and I'll show you where that comes up in the letter. Pardon me. He says, the increase in the price of meat, which you mentioned in your letter, like the increase in prices for just about everything we buy, is connected with the larger problem we call inflation, in which we spend more and more of our money and get less and less. So that it was clearly on his mind, and quite honestly, that was the height of inflation, mid-1975. So by that time, and I apologize for flipping and getting your eyes all boggled with this, by that time, inflation had reached 11-12% annually, which is a huge deal in the United States at that point. And the other thing was, remember that prior table where inflation really didn't become an issue until after World War II. It hadn't been studied either. By the early 1970s, we'd only really had inflation around for a few years. So nobody really knew what to do with it. How bad is it? Is it really bad? What if inflation comes with growth? What if inflation comes with higher levels of employment? So two different kinds of things people that were economists came up with. Arthur Oken was an economist, and he said, we really shouldn't just look at inflation. You should look at the sum, the total of inflation and the unemployment rate. So in other words, if you're getting a lot of inflation, but the unemployment rate's going down, that's kind of okay. And stagflation was another thing. You want to avoid inflation, but not having any growth in the economy. And that was by McLeod. So both of those things were on the mind of President Ford, pretty in the forefront of his thoughts in that early 1975, late 1974 period. In fact, the economy left by President Nixon had the highest misery index, which was inflation plus unemployment, that we'd ever had. In fact, it reached 20% at the time of the letter that I got, and he's not only dealing with that, but he's of course got Watergate hanging out there. He's got the end of the Vietnam War. So it's a tough time for President Ford. Okay. So he decides, now I'm a microeconomist. Those of you that are in the economic space know that there's a micro and a macro. And the micro is more the business side of economics, and the macro is more the government role in economics. And I will be the first to tell you that it's not really my specialty, and quite honestly, it's a little bit less of the quantitative part of economics. It's a little more of the policy side. Nobody quite knows this is the right way to do it, that's the right way to do it. Now, the politicians will tell you, oh, this is clearly the right way to do it, and that's clearly the right way to do it. We don't really know, to be honest. But what President Ford decided to do was increase government spending and lower taxes, which sound good. Everyone says, oh, the government's going to give us stuff, we don't have to pay as much in. But of course, you can't do that like in a household, the same thing. If you spend more money and don't bring as much money in, you're going to increase your deficit. So over time, you can't do that, but you do have to think about that in short periods where you can try to create a stimulus, which is really what he tried to do, is try to get the economy jump-started. And we'll see how that worked. In fact, in the 1976 election, he had some things that really were kind of interesting. So the biggest thing was the misery index really declined quickly in late 1975 and 1976. But it had been bad for so long and throughout this period that it was a great campaign issue for Carter, at least until the end periods of the election. So Carter was way ahead, and over time, and in part because of the economic changes going through the country, Ford was really on the way back. And in fact, many people say if the election were held 2 weeks later or a month later, Ford would have won. It was a very, very close election. And of course, President Carter's economic record, even though that's what he campaigned on, really was a trouble for him. His misery index skyrocketed, even be higher than what Ford had inherited. So of course, he did not win that election as well. Okay. I think we're doing fine on time. So I find that the timing of thinking about these issues is particularly interesting. That you see a lot in the press at a certain time, and you see things after the fact. So, for example, with FDR, when I was a kid growing up, everyone said, oh, FDR did all these things, and all of a sudden he fixed depression, and the economy was great, and that was kind of the conventional thinking shortly after the 1930s and even through the 1970s when I was going to school. That's not really the case anymore. I think scholarship today says it's kind of at best mixed results for Roosevelt economically, and really he was saved economically by World War II. President Ford, I think, kind of got the other side of things where he didn't have enough time in office to get the sort of benefit of any economic policies, and he wasn't really thought of as sort of a great economic president. But if you look, for example, here at the overall changes in the misery index over the time period that these guys were president, the ones going from the top down are better, meaning Reagan, Ford, Clinton had the best kind of changes in the misery index. In other words, it went down during their time period, whereas Eisenhower, Carter, and Nixon saw it go up during their time period. So there are indications now that the economic policies by Ford were more positive than people had thought at that time. And the thing that got me more personal on this was the pardon, which was a central thing that my father worked on. And for many years, of course, that was considered a negative for President Ford, that, oh, you shouldn't have pardoned President Nixon for this reason or that reason. But over time, scholarship changed and public opinion changed on it. And in particular, you'll see a picture up here with Senator Kennedy and Caroline Kennedy, when my father's favorite book was called Profiles in Courage by John Kennedy. And it was interesting that his daughter wrote kind of an updated version, Profiles in Courage in Our Time. And it was really a book that gave chapters to political courage, examples of political courage. And the thing that really was a big deal to both President Ford and my father, and by definition me, was the one chapter devoted to President Ford and the pardon. And that's really what he's getting this award for. Believe it or not, with Senator Kennedy and his daughter there. So I appreciate your time, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you have. Once again, if we can get you guys over to the microphone for questions, that would be great. But if you want to raise your hand, I'll go with that. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you for the wonderful presentation. It was very enlightening. We hear several weeks ago they announced the happiness index, and Finland, of course, won this year's happiness index. So I was wondering, in your opinion, what's the relationship between the happiness index and the misery index, and what we can do in America to do better on the happiness index?
That's tricky. Well, the misery index is not necessarily intended to show how unhappy people are from an emotional standpoint. I think what we found, and I don't know this literature so well, but what we find is that people who are at a similar wealth level in terms of absolute numbers in different countries, but in one country they're considered wealthy, in another country they're considered poor, even though their lifestyle is very similar in both countries, they always have this comparative thing that it's kind of the keeping up with the Joneses. Even though you're having the same lifestyle, if your lifestyle is worse than your neighbor, you tend to be unhappy. And I think that tends to be the tricky part of any capitalist societies, that you're going to see the Warren Buffetts of the world and the Jeff Bezos actually went to high school with me, Jeff Bezos of the world, that have this amazing level of wealth. And no matter how well you're doing and how healthy you are, it's harder to have the happiness than if you're living in, say, Latin America, where everyone's sort of at a similar poverty level.
Yeah, but I think also in Finland, the consequences of unemployment are not as drastic as they are in the United States.
Well,
Because
right.
the government shores them up.
That's
better
true.
than we do here.
That's true.
So I was wondering if you did a misery index for a country like Finland, whether it would have the same parameter of unemployment that we do in our misery.
You could certainly create a different type of misery index there, and certainly if there are different incentives or lack of incentives for unemployment, it's going to have an impact on that. So I think you're right. It's hard to make an apples-to-apples comparison of the misery index in Finland and the U.S. It's a little easier to do the U.S. today versus the U.S. last year. So country by country is always a little bit tricky, but I understand it's not an easy answer.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you for your talk today. I remember when I was in high school, when President Ford was putting in wage and price controls, and I thought that was kind of strange because that's like keeping kids in a recess. They're just going to let it come out again.
Yep.
And that was my reaction then. And then later, when I was a student at UCLA in the economics classes, they were monetarists, and we were taught that expanding the money supply faster or slower has a lot to do with inflation. And I'm sort of curious as to why the Fed wasn't as involved with controlling the money supply back when Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter were presidents, because that had a lot to do with them not getting reelected.
Well, it's true. There's a lot of factors that go into why they did or didn't get reelected, and I think part of what you're seeing is
Inflation.
Sure, but part of what you're seeing is that the tools that we have today for inflation that we know about today. So we know a lot more about how to handle inflation today than we did 20 years ago, and certainly, but even by the time you were in school, they were starting to get more knowledge of that. But it's still not a perfect decision that you know if you do A, you're definitely going to get B. There's still a lot of noise in those decisions. And ultimately, when Ford was there, you really only had 25 years worth of inflation data and probably only 5 or 6 years worth of inflation research as to what to do. So I think that's part of it. I don't know all the details inside on the politics, but I think ultimately inflation was a kind of a new animal at that time, and nobody really knew how to handle it. Thank you.
I'll concede that you outwalked me on Edley Stevenson. But I will bet you with Roosevelt died that he was married in New York City, although yes, with the attendance of Theodore.
Oh, that may very well be. That may very well be.
I guess as I listen to it, and this is an old issue, but I think the misery index is, I think, overrated. Because inflation within limits, before it gets just feeding on itself, is really, has no impact on real wealth. Some aggregate, certainly. Some people gain, some people lose. You pay me more for my goods, I get more. Unemployment, on the other hand, represents a real loss of GDP, let's just, for want of a better word.
Sure.
And so I've always felt that there was a certain asymmetry and a mistake in adding those things together. But you weren't the first person to do it.
Sure. No, I think you're right. I think you can get into any of these measures. Even unemployment today probably needs more refining, right? Because more people are getting out of the market, so they're not included in the ratio at all. So you can get into issues of what percentage of the people are in the workforce as opposed to what percentage are trying to get in but are out. So there are different ways of getting that. But I certainly, the people that could be contributing to the GDP that aren't is a big deal, however you measure that.
One other question. When you say 17.2% unemployment in 1939, are we treating as unemployed the people who are in federal work programs like WPA, PWA?
Yeah, I'll have to check those data. I don't recall offhand, but I think if they are considered federal employees, they would not be considered unemployed. But if they were in a certain program, that's possible. I don't know. I'd have to check that.
The labor statistics on that leave out that important factor that FDR put a lot of
That may be.
work
Yeah.
didn't get counted. The other thing that is misleading about looking at just 1939 is there was tremendous improvement up till 1936 or 7.
There was certainly improvement, and it was going in that direction. That's true. Yes.
And then the theory was now it's the economy's improving. It's time to throw away the crutches, which meant any kind of fiscal and monetary stimulus. And so it was not really a repudiation of stimulus policy. It was an abandonment of stimulus policy that caused that recession in 1938.
Certainly, there is some of that. That's right. It's not a super easy thing to get at. But thank you very much for your good points.
Hello, my name is David. I'm a student at the University of Michigan. I just remember, obviously, Ford came out right on the heels of the OPEC crisis, and I remember reading about it a little bit and his response, but I was just wondering if you could give me a little refresher on what his policies toward those types of foreign policy dealings overseas were.
Oh. That may take a while. I'm happy to answer that in more detail there. But well, first he had to deal with Vietnam, so that didn't really end until '75. You're right. I think more of the OPEC occurred during Nixon, and some of it was still lingering at that time. And he had a lot of. I think the whole when you get in the whole all foreign public policy, that may take a longer time, and I don't necessarily know it all offhand, but at a high level, that's what I can tell you.
Sure. So I'm also just took a basic economics class last semester,
Sure.
and remember seeing the graph of the monopoly, what happens to the prices and stuff.
Right.
Not to bash your former classmate Bezos, that's pretty funny. But, so what do you think some of the actions can be taken to either regulate, or is everything fine in terms of some of these big companies, tech giants right now? What is your opinion?
Sure. I think it's hard to generalize about all the companies, and we all have somewhat of a bias in the way we think. Some people tend to be more regulatory focused. Some people tend to be more deregulatory focused. I'm certainly more of the latter, that it's more of the invisible hand, and I try to keep government out as much as possible. So everyone's got a different angle on that. I don't see any one particular company that's causing what you learn in school as a dead weight loss that's significant today. To be honest, I'm not studying them and going into detail with the data, but there may be some where more regulation or a check on a merger might be important. But I haven't seen it personally that I say, aha, this needs to happen, like the Northern Securities back in the 1900s.
I'm Robin Chapin. Would you suggest some authors that I could pass on to some refugees that we're working with that would spark your enthusiasm for economics.
Wow.
They're not getting, they don't, what's being presented to them in high school doesn't leave them thinking, oh, wow, let's study economics. Even though they've lived through what you describe as multiple
Wow.
living situations. What would you recommend?
Sure. Well,
to take to these learning folks?
sure. Well, there are a lot of good authors. It depends on the level at which the students are studying. So,
They're very bright, and English is coming in.
okay. Well, I mean, I started with it's where are we? There we go. With Adam Smith, and it does give a good. I know it's the first book and all that, and but it's a great baseline. I also like people that can write to a normal audience that are not. Most economists, and I'm in that category, tend to write for other economists and not for real world problems. So graduate school and professors are trained to write economics papers that don't necessarily deal with the real world, but deal with certain types of mathematical systems and certain types of data. And so reading papers that are published in the top economics journals is kind of interesting, but usually they're not that practical, and usually they're hard to grasp. A book I read recently, which is an old book, but the author really got people, was Milton Friedman. And he wrote a book called There's No Such Thing as a Free Lunch, or something to that effect. Just a great book with 1 or 2 page vignettes on different topics. So I'll think about some other ones, but those kind of come to mind as places to start.
Thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
At the time of the pardon of Nixon, what were the comments and attitudes in Congress about the pardon?
Ooh. Well, I will tell you that I was 7 years old at the time, and the comments I got, and then I'll get to your answer in more detail, and I wanted to bring that up in the talk, I did skip through that, was my teacher sent home a long letter excoriating my father and President Ford about doing the worst thing ever and how this is the horrible thing. And my mother literally had to come into school and get me taken out of the class and really have to yell at the principal and have to go over her head. And in fact, it wasn't just like today where people are so at odds with each other. In fact, I had a 7-year-old friend who I used to play basketball with and football with, and his mother called my mother and said, my son can't play with your son anymore, or something to that effect. And so I never knew this until about 40 years later, but apparently that's how things were. In terms of Congress, yeah, certainly Congress was not very friendly to it. The press was not very friendly to it. It was not something that was done in political expediency. It was done because President Ford thought it was the right thing to do.
Hi there. I'd like to ask, I know nothing about this subject, so I thought
Okay.
I'd ask for a little bit of clarification.
Sure.
On when you were talking about the gold standard and the free silver coinage,
Yes.
I'd never heard of that. Could you sort of fill us in a little bit about
Oh, sorry.
what it was about?
A little bit, yeah. So, broadly speaking, the having silver as a second unit of exchange besides gold, to use against your paper money, was something that the farmers wanted, because the gold was sort of controlled in a very small grouping of the eastern banks, and that had some bad impacts on the pricing for farmers and what they could get with their profits. But with silver giving another option, they at least believed that would have a beneficial effect to them. So it was that bimetallism, they called it, was what they were asking for, as opposed to just the gold standard and this cross of gold. You're welcome.
Thank you very much for your explanation and a very clear talk.
Thank you.
Even though I think at some point that during your talk I may have nodded off.
I will try not to do the same now.
My question is a sequel to what the gentleman just referred to, gold and silver.
Yes.
What do you think is the role of bitcoins in all of this?
Oh.
In other words, maybe I'm opening a can of worms, but I don't know. But you see, the thing is that there are alternatives being proposed.
There are.
And so not many of us fully understand what these are and what the implications are, but you are an economist. So you think that you would know. Thank you.
Well, I'm an economist. I'm always able to throw out an opinion. I don't know that that means I know, but I will do my best. So I guess one thing that's certainly changed since this time period is that very few transactions, and certainly very few transactions of any noticeable amount, are done with cash. Everything now is through some type of credit or some type of bank transfer or a check. In fact, the largest bills now are what, $100 bills. There used to be $10,000 bills, and so and even though things cost more now, we have less cash. So in some sense, that I think has spurred this sort of Bitcoin type of movement. It's not clear to me where that's going to go. It seems in part a little bit of the bubble type of thing. It could be real. It's hard to know. But some of those bubbles really work. The tulip bubble really went on for a while, and people made a lot of money from it. So it's hard to tell. I've seen lots of investors get into it, but I think most people that I'd put more in the finance space than the economic space tend to stay out of that as much as they can. So I'll try to do the same, but thank you for the question. Oh, sorry, one more question.
I wanted to ask, that coinage, did it pass? I mean, did they, that hasn't ever happened, where they use silver?
We never had bimetallism. No, that didn't come. That's correct. Yep, you're right.
Okay.
All right. Well, thank you all very much.
This was a little bit of a different type of program. And Bryan, you held us spellbound. This is fascinating. Thank you all for coming. We have a pen set for Bryan for his future signing of his papers and his future publications, explaining economics for the. How about this? A book called Economics for the Rest of Us, something like that. And if you have questions about the Ford pardon, I can guarantee you that upstairs in our collections we have quite a bit of information, and we would welcome any and all of you to come as researchers. So thanks for coming. We have a reception in the lobby, and please do find our speaker and ask more questions. This has been a fascinating discussion for all of us. So glad to have you here, and especially glad to have you with us. Thanks.